Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 307. This week the questions are taken from Guide 384, the Spanish Santa Ana class first-rate ships of the line, the Wednesday video on how to build battleships' main guns, and the Friday video on the frigate duels of the War of 1812, that being the one between Essex, Phoebe and Cherub. So let's begin with questions. Apri City asks, what wood types were typically used by the large navies of the world for shipbuilding? In the vast majority of cases, if you're looking at age of sail warships, the choice of material for the hull was oak. Now, specific wood types like, say, elm might be used for the keel, and obviously you wouldn't use oak for the masts. That tended to be fir was the preferred option. But generally speaking, for the bulk of the material you're using in the ship, it's going to be some version of oak, whether that be English oak, white oak, live oak, Kazan oak. You know, the oak is quite a widely spread species in its various formats. Now, there were, of course, some exceptions to this, but for the most part, the age of sail shipbuilding nations, at least the classic ones we think of, generally speaking, had some species of oak growing in their territory, and oak is pretty much the ideal shipbuilding material. If you were building a ship in India, it would more likely be made out of teak, because that was very hard wearing, still is very hard wearing, and teak is relatively common, or at least, again, shipbuilding teak was fairly common in India, in and around the port cities where these ships were going to be constructed, and oak doesn't really have much of a presence in those parts of the Indian subcontinent. Apart from the lack of presence of oak, the other big exception as to why you might not build a ship's hull with oak would be if you were very, very pressed for time. Now, if you needed a ship really quickly and you didn't have stocks of seasoned wood on hand, then you could bite the bullet, so to speak, and accept that you were going to build a ship out of basically whatever it was you could get your hands on at the time. It was going to be unseasoned, so it didn't really matter too much as long as it kept the water out for a short period, because it was going to rot, warp, and so forth anyway, so the ship wouldn't be expected to have too long a lifespan. And in that respect, some of the more rapidly built ships, for example, some of the ships on the Great Lakes in the War of 1812, were built out of pine and other softwoods because, well, they were available, they could be cut fairly quickly, and they roughly stay in the correct shape for as long as they thought they were going to need the ships. Now, as I mentioned earlier, because of the particular properties you want from a keel, ash or elm or woods with similar properties were quite often used for the keels of major ships if you could find a wood of that particular type, because oak can be used for a ship's keel, but a slightly more flexible wood like ash or elm that still has a lot of strength is a little bit more preferred for that. And then when you come to the masts, again, as I said earlier, you'd use fir or pine ideally because they grow nice and tall and straight. And if you couldn't get your hands on those, then that's when composite masts start to come in, which, as the name suggests, are essentially masts that look like they're single tall straight timbers, but are in fact made up of a whole bunch of smaller, thinner timbers, usually banded together with iron rings. So composite masts do have one or two slight advantages in some respects compared to monolithic masts, but generally speaking, the monolithic mast, i.e. the mast that's made up of a single piece of wood, is preferred. Now, of course, the overall mast construction may not be a single massive tree trunk. It might be made up of two or three stepped up, one and then the other and then the next. But in a monolithic construction, each of those would be a single trunk, as opposed to each of those mast sections being composite. Tom Finn asks, while size matters, a ship needs a well-trained crew, or it's just so much woodwork. How did the Spanish crews compare with the British crews in terms of skill and experience. And this is from the Santa Ana video. Now, it's just as well, though, specify this is from the Santa Ana video because the answer to this question can change quite a lot during the overall age of sail. So if we were talking about a Spanish crew in the time of the Spanish Armada, for example, that would be a completely different story to the late 1700s, early 1800s. But in the period of the Santa Ana class, as I have mentioned, I think once or twice in previous dry docks, the Spanish have a kind of they have a very, very split system. It's not kind of, it is incredibly split, but it works generally to their disadvantage because the Spanish officer corps was usually relatively experienced and sort of trending from that up to actually pretty experienced. And indeed, some Spanish officers were even British trained. And they knew what they were doing. They knew how to handle their ships. And they were generally very brave and fairly competent. I mean, apart from anything else, look at the conduct of the Spanish at the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, obviously, that's, again, this being the internet, that's not saying there were no French officers who were competent and brave. There's, half a dozen you could name quite easily, starting with, of course, poor old Admiral Magon, but nonetheless. The problem that the Spanish had in, if you like, the Napoleonic time period was that their crew system was such that unless you had someone who actively volunteered to be on the ships, which was relatively rare, the majority of the crew worked in a system that, whilst it allowed the Spanish Navy to keep its manpower up, actually made it virtually impossible to have a truly experienced crew, because what they would do is you essentially had a shift system, if you like. So if you were listed as being of a maritime disposition, and that doesn't mean that you were a fisherman or a merchant sailor, it just meant you happened to live within X distance of something that the Spanish considered maritime, ports, rivers, etc., then you could potentially be called up for service in the Navy. So basically conscription. But your time of service was fixed. It was not tremendously long. And it also had to include travel time. So if your time of service was due to expire in, let's say, 2 or 3 months, and it was going to take you, let's say, half that time to get home, because perhaps your home city might not be actually anywhere near the Spanish coast, well, then you had to be discharged, a month or two before your time was actually up, because you were still in service while you were traveling, and then you had to get home before your service was up. Otherwise, the Spanish government owed you a bunch more money, which they didn't want to pay. And what this essentially meant is, as people came on, as their shifts were called up, you would have a draft of people who would arrive who obviously had never seen each other before, and even if they had seagoing experience, may never, and almost certainly have never served on a warship before, so they're very green. They've then got to be inducted onto how you actually sail and fight a warship. Then there will, of course, be people from other previous drafts aboard the ship, but the ones who've been there for a couple of years, or coming up to a couple of years, who've just gotten probably to a point where they're relatively experienced, A, are in a minority, and B, they're about to be let go. So they've got a relatively minimal time to pass on their experience before the people with a bit of experience who are halfway through their allocation are now the senior most. And as a result, a lot of Spanish ships, I think it was either Nelson or one of the other British officers of the period who summed it up, who said the Spanish, they have the ships, but they don't have the men. And they were referring to the general rank and file. And essentially, it was true. Spanish rank and file sailors were dramatically lacking in experience compared to British sailors, or indeed sailors of most other navies, which was, of course, then compounded by the fact that, thanks to the British blockades, the Spanish spent a lot of time in port. But obviously there are exceptions that prove the rule, because there were Spanish rank and file sailors who volunteered and actually wanted to serve in the Navy, and of course they had a chance to build up more experience. And in a kind of intermediate thing, you also had ships that perhaps had been mostly crewed from a single draft, which meant that initially, of course, they were horrifically inexperienced, but a year and a half down the line, they might have, on average, actually considerably more experience than the average Spanish Navy vessel. It's just that that happy set of circumstances would only last for another 6 months or so before a whole bunch of them were discharged and you had to start over. BK Zhang asks, was there a frantic rush to cancel ships of the line that were being planned once ironclads and the steam engine had proven themselves? Yes and no. In smaller navies, wooden warship construction continued for a little while, in part because they didn't have the money or the industry to actually build ironclads, and so building wooden warships, if they had any planned or under construction, at least gave them something. And of course, most of the time they were thinking about fighting other smaller navies that were in a similar situation to themselves. In the larger navies, again, the answer kind of splits down kind of yes and no. In the, take for example, the Royal Navy, which is obviously the biggest one at the time, when Warrior is launched, so at that point she's not commissioned, and definitely you couldn't say she hasn't proven herself, because she's not even in service yet, but just by entering the water, Warrior pretty much prompts the cancellation of any and all further development of the wooden ship of the line, because, as I've mentioned before, to a certain extent, Warrior was an example of putting together a bunch of mature technologies or semi-mature technologies, the Armstrong 110 pounder aside, that the UK had been working on for several years already. So they knew what this represented. And as such, although you do have wooden ships of the line being laid down even in 1860, pretty much anything that has been laid down in 1860 or is on the stocks that isn't already quite significantly advanced is paused to see if they can be converted into ironclads. So that's where you get this run in the 1860s in the Royal Navy of you have the iron-hulled warships like Warrior and so forth, the new builds, but you also have a bunch of wooden-hulled ironclads, which are the remnants of the late 1850s capital shipbuilding program, now being converted over. So you could say that they were cancelled in as much as they were not completed in the way that they were originally intended to be, but on the other hand, they weren't necessarily cancelled because the work that had gone into the wooden hulls at that point was continued with. It's just the whole design was then adapted quite significantly. So I think it would perhaps be more accurate to summarize it as, at least in the major navies, the introduction of ironclads meant that further planning for wooden ships of the line ceased, but there was no particular rush to get rid of stuff that was already underway, even if it was relatively minimal, keel laying and a few frames in place, purely because there was potential utility in converting them into ironclads, albeit somewhat secondary vessels, at least in the major navies, or, as would happen with some that were a bit further along in construction, commissioning them as training vessels or second-line vessels just to, bulk up the numbers, because initially having Warrior in the Royal Navy or Gloire in the Marine Nationale is all well and good, but if you only have one or two of the things, you still need the majority of your fleet around just to be in various places, and so wooden warships would still have utility for quite a while until the ironclad building race meant that there were enough ironclads to be on station in most of the core areas, at least. You still see wooden warships, albeit with auxiliary screw power, present as station flagships in the more distant portions of the planet for quite a long time after the 1860s. C. Babylon asks, how do you rate the Santa Ana design compared to their contemporaries in both France and England? I think compared to the Océan class, which is the contemporary French first-rate ships of the line that are being built at the time, it's very difficult to choose between them. They've got approximately similar top speeds. The Santa Anas are very fractionally smaller and very fractionally less gunned, but only by the tiniest amount. And at least if you're looking at the Havana-built ships of the class, well, the Havana shipyards were some of the best in the time period. So if you were going to balance that qualitative advantage, which I think is fair to give them, up against the Oceans, then I think the slight size and firepower advantages the Oceans have probably disappear into that. So for those situations, Ocean versus Santa Ana, it's pretty much a coin toss, and it would be down to whoever was on board, the quality of the crew and the officers, obviously, as well. Compared to contemporary British ships of the line, that's a much more difficult question, because the French and the Spanish both build essentially classes. The British don't really do so. You've got Victory, which predates the Oceans and Santa Anas by a fair margin. You've got Royal Sovereign, which is roughly contemporary with the earlier ones, but is also a one-off. Theoretically, you've got Royal George and Queen Charlotte, which are very slightly later contemporaries, but can you call two ships a run that constitutes a class? Now, just looking overall at their capabilities, the British ships are a little bit smaller. They're somewhat less heavily armed because they're 100 or 104 gunners, depending on how you count the guns and the piercings, as compared to both the French and Spanish vessels, which are almost, although not quite, 120 gun ships. So again, putting crew quality aside, in terms of just being a fighting vessel, the Santa Anas would be superior to most Royal Navy first rates. But there are a few qualifications to that. There is, of course, the fact that Victory is a superb design that is going to be faster, so she will be able to, within a certain degree of practicality, dictate what's going on in the engagement in a hypothetical matchup. And, of course, you have the fact that British ships, generally speaking, at this point, tend to be slightly smaller than the top-of-the-line contemporaries. So British have 74s. The French especially tend to go with 80 gunners quite a lot for their third rates at this time period. But the flip side then is that the British ships are somewhat more agile. So if you were to compare the Santa Anas to the British contemporary ships of the line, the British ships are likely to be able, again, just purely from physical properties rather than quality of crew issues, they're likely to be a little bit more agile, a little bit more able to control how the fight happens, but the Santa Anas are going to hit harder once the fight begins. The biggest problem in comparing how a fight between an Ocean, a Santa Ana, and any one of the contemporary British first rates would have gone, if you're looking at a historical evaluation, is, of course, that massive gap in crew qualities you're going to have between the various ships, which is not a fault of the ship designs themselves. And separately, you also obviously have the fact that Royal Navy ships of the line could and did mount any number of carronades, which significantly increase their overall firepower beyond their rated firepower, and the fact that during the time period that all three were likely to potentially run into each other, the French and Spanish equivalents of carronades weren't really all that successful. That changes the equation somewhat in terms of a real straight-up fight, but in terms of if you had exactly the same crew and access to exactly the same kind of cannon technology, and all you were worrying about was the material quality of the ship, and how many guns can you physically carry, how fast can it sail, how tough is it in a fight, well, at that point you would be hard pressed to find anything better than a Santa Ana class. It's a very tight race at that top end of things, but they are absolutely superb ships. I mean, even with those firepower in terms of the carronades and crew advantages, it still took Royal Sovereign over 2 hours to fight one of the Santa Anas into the ground at Trafalgar, and that was basically a kind of it wasn't a mutual kill because neither of them sank, but it was effectively a mutual neutralization, because once that fight was over, Royal Sovereign was capable of still fighting, but not on anything like the same level she had been when she'd gone into that combat. Raptor Beast asks, what are some never-built ship designs that you think had the most potential to be good designs? I think there's different designs that stand out in different eras. For the immediate post-World War I, early interwar period, I think probably the one that stands out the most to me is the G3 battle cruisers, seen as the Tier 9 Duncans in World of Warships. Of the various, what if you like, Washington cherry tree ships, so the South Dakotas, Lexingtons, G3s, N3s, Amagis, and Tosas, I think the G3s had the most potential. I think they were the single most capable designs all round. Obviously, the N3s had more firepower, the South Dakotas had more guns as well, and both of those ships carried more armor, but the G3s were a lot quicker and not too far off in terms of protection, and certainly, still carried quite respectable firepower. But the main reason I think the G3s are probably the ones with the most potential from that era is that if you compare their stats with the stats of World War II era fast battleships, and then run the same comparison for the other five big designs, what you'll notice is that essentially the G3s are the only ones that could have served competitively in a World War II environment with relatively minimal changes. Slap a new radar set on top and maybe update the fire control system, albeit if they had been built, they would have had Admiralty Fire Control Mark 1, same as Nelson Rodney, which isn't too bad, but still. So new fire control, new radar, and either a few more anti-aircraft guns or replace the secondary and heavy AA batteries entirely with new AA guns. And fundamentally, it's a perfectly capable World War II era design. It's got the firepower, it's got the speed, it's got the armor. Whereas the N3s and South Dakotas, they have the firepower and the armor, but they do not have the speed. The Lexington has the speed and the firepower, but doesn't have the armor. And the Tosas and the Amagis have the firepower and the speed, but also not really the protection to be full-on capital ships, at least in a World War II environment. A number of the early to mid-1910s US Navy battlecruiser designs that were floated around also had a fair bit of potential. Now, obviously, some of them would have been 12-inch gunships and would have had to also bite the bullet come the Washington Naval Treaty, but a few of the later ones where they're looking at 14 and possibly even some of the early 16-inch gun variants before they start the design trend that heads towards the Lexingtons could potentially have, been fairly creditable designs again all the way through to the Second World War. They would have been a little bit short of protection compared to battleship designs, but as battle cruisers, they're not expected to carry quite as much. And they could have occupied a similar place in the US Navy to that which Repulse and Renown had in the Royal Navy. The other one, which I'm not necessarily sure it would have made a fantastic design in and of itself, but certainly would have been a design with a huge amount of potential in terms of changing the course of naval design and development history as we know it, it would be one of the designs that was drafted up in potential response to the Italian, not even pre-drafted, ironclads at that point, which eventually ended up mounting 17.7-inch guns. Specifically, I'm thinking of the one that went with 3 twin turrets. Now, I'm not sure loading up a slightly longer devastation hull with 3 twin turrets would make it a particularly good vessel, but if it introduced the idea of more than 2 main gun turrets to mainline battleship development, even before the pre-dreadnought period, then potentially, if you define multi-turret as more than 2, multi-turreted battleships may actually have come about long before dreadnought, and thus, the entire design period of the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s might be completely different, which is a lot of potential change. Michael D'Antoni asks, why didn't the Germans not produce anything larger than 11-inch guns prior to Bismarck and Tirpitz, for example, for the Sharnhorst class or for the Panzerschiff, when they obviously didn't care about naval limitations in the interwar period? Well, the basic answer is that the Germans did care about the naval limitations in the interwar period, at least in the early part of it. So initially, when you had the Weimar Republic, or the Weimar government, whatever you want to call it, the Germans were sticking as close as they could to the limitations of the Versailles Treaty, which said their capital ships couldn't be more than 10,000 tons and couldn't have bigger than 11-inch guns. This is the period in which the Deutschland class are designed. Then you have the early 1930s as the Nazis begin to take over, and then, of course, in 1933 onwards, they're fully in power. Now, at that point, you have the design progression that leads from the Deutschlands to an upgraded version of the Deutschlands, and then eventually to the Scharnhorsts. The initial designs, being evolutions of the Deutschlands, retained the 11-inch guns, and bear in mind again that in the early part of the Nazi government of Germany, while they were looking at rebuilding the Kriegsmarine as a war fleet, they were primarily looking at a war fleet to oppose the French. And they were also concerned that, given that even the evolved Deutschlands were in excess of the Versailles limits, if they also pushed for big guns, 15 or 16-inch guns, then that would get set off the Royal Navy. Whereas if they had ships armed with 11-inch guns, then it wouldn't worry the Royal Navy as much, because the Royal Navy would look at them and go, well, they're clearly inferior to pretty much anything we've got, and therefore we don't have to worry about them too much. There was a brief point at which Hitler went, actually, you know what, once he'd concluded the Anglo-German naval agreement, maybe we should have them with twin 15-inch guns, but again, political sensitivities around how that would affect the Royal Navy, and the fact that, suddenly deciding midway through the design process we're going to have a completely new gun, that's not really going to work without massively delaying things, and so they kept going with the 11-inch plan, which is how you got the Scharnhorsts as they came out. Subsequent to that, there were less concerns, but that's essentially why the Deutschlands and the Scharnhorst have the 11 inches, and then having decided midway through the Scharnhorst design process that actually we want 15-inch guns, the next class of German capital ships had the 15-inch guns. And ironically enough, given that they did obviously end up at war with the Royal Navy, which they were trying to avoid with the whole 11-inch armed Scharnhorst thing, the whole principle of the Royal Navy probably wouldn't worry too much about the Scharnhorst in terms of capital ship on capital ship engagements was kind of proven true. I mean, obviously they did sink things like Glorious, and they proved to be very annoying commerce raiders, but in terms of straight up capital ship fights, of course you have the 15-inch armed, albeit minimally because they only got 6 guns, and not particularly heavily armoured Renown sees off both Scharnhorsts at Lofoten. And even when the Scharnhorsts come across poor old Malaya plodding around escorting a convoy, again, even though it's 2v1, they decide discretion is the better part of valor and withdraw. Because although they have a multiplicity of guns and a speed advantage, the simple fact is that a battleship like Malaya, and maybe not so much battleships like Renown, except for perhaps at longer ranges and weird angles, but definitely something like Malaya, can protect itself over its vitals against 11-inch shell fire. The return is not necessarily true for all parts of the Scharnhorsts, even when facing Malaya's somewhat older 15-inch guns. Laminat asks, this might be balancing on the edge of the channel's scope, but how was WMD protection, or NBC protection, implemented on older steam-powered warships where the force draft system might have proved a problem in case of airborne radioisotopes or chemical weaponry in the air outside? I recall reading some Soviet ships had a pressurized cabin with remote controls for that kind of situation, so maybe Western counterparts had something similar. Now, this is something I only have a limited amount of knowledge on because, as you mentioned, it is on the edge of the channel scope. NBC protection for ships was pretty much implemented in the mid to late 50s onwards, so beyond the scope of the channel. And as a result, I don't know how everybody did it. There are certain bits of knowledge I have, like, for example, with Belfast here. When she was refitted, initially, the idea was to have the ship fully NBC-proofed. So positive pressure, sealed environment, and so, as long as you kept the exterior hatches shut, the ship could continue as normal. That didn't quite pan out. When she was refitted, she had partial NBC proofing, so what were considered to be the vital areas were made NBC proof with a positive pressure system, but not the entirety of the ship. Now, of course, as you mentioned, older steam-powered warships, and indeed any steam-powered or non-nuclear powered warship, has to take in air to burn in the engine rooms, and so this is a bit of a problem. As far as I'm aware, with a ship like Belfast, and from the sounds of it, what you said in your question with some Soviet ships, the idea was that via refit to make the engines, the boilers and engine systems run in such a way as that they could be automatically run from remote positions rather than necessitating people right up close and personal to make adjustments all the time. Now, again, as far as I recall, on Belfast, the idea was that this would be for a certain number of hours. So that would either allow you to clear the immediate zone if you were talking about radiological contamination from a nuclear weapon, or if you were in a more generally contaminated region, then you could at least get away from the higher concentrations. And of course, there would have been a degree of NBC gear for people to very periodically enter the boiler spaces and so forth to, again, make fine corrections or repairs and such like. But again, this is a partial refit, less than what was originally planned in the first place on one particular light cruiser in the Royal Navy. So those of you who may actually have served in such modified ships in the US Royal, French, etc. navies, or who have studied the post-1950s navies in more detail and would like to elaborate on exactly how you run a ship that has a forced draft system, i.e. big blowers coming in to supply air to the engine room in an environment where those could bring in a lot of potential NBC contaminants without killing the engine crew, please let us know in the comments below how that was done. Jared Core asks, why do some barrels have a more pronounced neck at the end of the barrel and some don't? Is this a jacket versus hoop versus wire wound effect? So here you can see on the 8-inch guns aboard HMS Canberra a somewhat pronounced flare at the end. The reason for this flare is potentially one of two things. The more generic reason is that obviously a gun is under pressure as the propellant expands and combusts. But if you take any arbitrary point, a slice, if you like, through the gun barrel at any stage of expansion, in the general case, well, obviously the breech is very heavily built up. The rest of the barrel, you have a force trying to expand and split the barrel, but when those stresses are resisted by the barrel, they are also somewhat transferred and resisted by the material on either side of the arbitrary point you're considering, i.e. whatever position is under stress has support from material to the left and right of it, or up and down the barrel, however you want to look at it. But that imparts a certain degree of resistance. Obviously, those other areas may also be under increasing or decreasing amounts of stress, but there is still that support. Of course, once you get to the end of the barrel, there is a very brief situation where you have a very high pressure environment as the shell is exiting. Obviously, the blast does go a little bit around the shell as well, but whilst the shell is mostly plugging the barrel, and just as it exits the barrel, you have a very high pressure point immediately behind the projectile, and at the very tip of the barrel there is obviously a lot of force, but it is only being supported by the material behind it. There is no further material in front of it, and this will make the very end of the barrel a little bit more susceptible to cracking and splitting and peeling. One of the ways that you can counter this is to just put more material at the end of the barrel to provide it with greater intrinsic strength, and therefore not having to rely quite so much on the surrounding material, and that can lead to a flare, which obviously would look something like this. The other reason is very specific to do with wire wound guns, which is why you see these flared barrels a lot more on British guns in the early part of the 20th century. And as I mentioned in the building Battleship's Main Battery video, which is where this question is from, If you have a wire-wound gun, then at some point the wire winding has to stop and you have to cap it off, and obviously that is a change in the material properties of the gun. Wire winding is good in various conditions when it comes to how the gun is going to work, but you can't run the wire winding right up to the very, very end of the gun, otherwise the wire will just spool out and spring out like a giant slinky, and therefore you have to cap it off. And if you're going to cap it off, now you're dealing, well, there's a lot of complicated physics, but essentially, very, very crudely, you're dealing with having to cap off the wire, which is under great tension, as well as the blast. And again, all of this needs additional material, and hence on British guns you very often get this flare, and whereas on barrels that are made up purely of jackets without the wire winding, this kind of flare at the end is much less common, unless the designer is being ultra conservative or potentially looking at very, very high pressure guns. Ardent asks, I recently asked you to take a second look at your position that during and just before the War of 1812, American flagged ships commonly were crewed by large numbers of Royal Navy deserters who could be identified at a glance by any Royal Navy Marine in an armed boarding party, and thus the war. I don't think that's a position I've ever held. If it came across that way, I do apologise. It means I was unclear in explaining myself. I think what I may have said, which may have got somewhat lost in the translation, is that a relatively high proportion of Royal Navy deserters ended up on American flagged ships. And that's for, well, two primary reasons. Firstly, I mean, this is assuming that a Royal Navy deserter actually wanted to continue being a sailor. Quite a number of them didn't, but for the ones that did, the two main reasons are obviously common language. If you desert to a French, Spanish, Swedish, Danish, Italian, well, whatever, Kingdom of Italy, etc., navy, 99.9% of the people on that ship are not going to speak your language, and you're not going to speak their language. Whereas if you desert and join an American vessel, well, okay, great. Now everyone speaks roughly the same language, so that makes the transition a lot easier. And then secondly, you have the fact that at the time that we're talking about, i.e. the run-up to the War of 1812, the British are at war with a good chunk of Europe, including, of course, France and Spain, the two largest navies after the Royal Navy. And that makes things a bit more problematic, because if you imagine you're a hypothetical Royal Navy deserter, you might not want to be in the Royal Navy anymore, but there's a difference between, I mean, it's still all desertion, but in the mind of a potential deserter, there is a difference between I am leaving this place I don't want to be, and potentially if they were oppressed man before, potentially have never wanted to be, and just going off to this other navy which is just off doing its own thing, which would be joining the US Navy or an American flag merchant vessel, versus I'm going to leave this vessel and go and join a French or Spanish vessel, which is a vessel which is directly and actively fighting my country. That's a whole new level of, treason. So, as somewhat understandably, if Royal Navy deserters are considering leaving their ships and going off to join some other ship, American flagged vessels are going to be far more attractive to them than virtually anybody else's. And then that combined with the fact that the US was relatively, at that time at least, relatively generous in handing out citizenship papers, then a number of Royal Navy servicemen felt that, well, okay, if I've got my American citizenship, therefore I'm an American citizen, therefore they can't take me back. Of course, then you had issues like the Chesapeake Leopard affair, where it turns out actually the Royal Navy kind of didn't really care all that much if you happened to somehow have acquired naturalization papers. In their view, you had been a British citizen, therefore you were a British citizen, and whatever else you said, you were being dragged back. Now, as far as being recognisable, that comes down to another factor. I mean, quite often Royal Navy ships would be looking for deserters from their own ship or from their own squadron. So the men aboard a frigate or similar would be familiar, of course, with the faces of the men from their own ship which had deserted, or from the men on other ships in their operational squadron which had deserted. So in that case, yes, it would be fairly obvious. And bear in mind, obviously, ships can stay on station for months, if not years. So just because somebody's deserted in February, let's say that frigate that he's deserted from hauls over an American ship 6 months down the line, it's probably still mostly the same crew on that frigate. So if someone is aboard that ship and was formerly part of that frigate's crew, they're going to recognize them. But also descriptions could be circulated to the wider station. And also, again, as was seen actually in the War of 1812, the British maintained a network of spies, secret agents, whatever you want to call them, informants, in US ports. And so even though there's a common language, people who were just recently arrived off a Royal Navy ship versus the local populace, there would be a somewhat recognizable difference, especially when questions were asked of like, who are you and where are you from? And that kind of information tended to find its way back to British ships. So if, somebody had been saying, oh, what, I see this ship's ready to sail, they've got an advertisement up for crew, I'd like to sign up. If some slightly shady character off to the side in the local tavern has overheard this, well then, whilst that ship is preparing, the Royal Navy frigate squadron on station might receive a letter that says, well, there's this chap goes by the name of John Smith. He is approximately 5'10", dark hair, middle-aged, prominent scar on his left cheek. I'm pretty sure he's a British deserter, at which point the squadron will go, anyone recognize this description? And then someone goes, oh, yeah, well, I served on this ship 9 months ago, and that chap just vanished randomly. Ah, okay, well, now we know he's on this ship, so if we overhaul this ship and have a look aboard, well, there happens to be a guy who meets this description. I wonder who he could be. That's more the intelligence-led side of things, but because of the semi-regular frequency of Royal Navy deserters showing up, it obviously wasn't entirely out of the question for a captain who just had general suspicions about a ship flying an American flag to stop them and have a quick look over. Although that was somewhat rarer. Usually, like with the Chesapeake Leopard affair, there was a degree of prior knowledge, or at least assumed prior knowledge, behind a specific stop and search. Warrant Officer Will asks, had the US actually completed their Great Lakes first rates, as well as the British finishing St. Lawrence's 2 companion ships, how do you think an actual engagement between the American and British formations would have gone, and what would have been the outcome of either side claiming a major victory? Well, assuming all 5 ships had been completed and were all out at sea at the same time, which becomes exponentially less likely the more of them there are, maybe one in refit or something, it would have been a very interesting battle because there were a very small handful of large frigates which had been constructed for Great Lakes service. But, as we've seen repeatedly, frigates do not have a place in a ship-of-the-line fight, and both the Wolfe class, Wolfe and Canada, as well as St. Lawrence, plus the New Orleans and Chippewa, the American ones, were very heavily gunned even for first rates of their time period. They were not quite unitary battery ships like you'd see the all-36 or all-32-pounder armaments later on, but they were carrying a lot of 32-pounders, both long guns and carronades, as well as 24-pounders, so the 18 or 12-pounder upper decks guns that you'd see on seagoing ships of the line weren't present. So they had a huge amount of firepower. That would, if you've got 5 first rates duking it out on the Great Lakes, that's not a fight that the frigates can get involved in unless they want to die exceptionally quickly. Their only real use at that point would be signalling and potentially taking a damaged ship of the line in tow. Now, of course, the big problem for the Americans at that point is that the British have 3 and they have 2, which means that if you've got a 2v2 engagement running, then one British ship of the line is free to pull itself into a raking position on one or the other of the Americans and demolish it pretty easily. So I think the Americans would still be playing very much on the defensive and looking for an opportunity where, by whatever means, they can isolate one or two of the British ships of the line, perhaps when one is in refit or something, and therefore they stand a much better chance at that point. But, of course, the British, if they know they have 3 ships of the line, are not under any particular obligation, unless something goes dramatically wrong in the land campaign, to facilitate that for the Americans. So I suspect that there would have been a lot of games of keep away being played by both sides, because what each side is prepared to accept as the conditions for a decisive engagement is very different. But if said decisive engagement happened, and for whatever reason one side or the other came out with a major victory, capturing or destroying all of the enemy's ships of the line, or at the very least so severely crippling them that they would need extensive repairs and therefore were effectively mission killed for the immediate moment, that would have been essentially game over as far as the Great Lakes were concerned. Whoever won that victory has won the Great Lakes period. I mean, you look at the short period of time St. Lawrence was active during the war, and the Americans basically went, no, we're not fighting that, stuff it, and essentially remained in harbour. If the British managed to destroy or badly damage, or worse still, capture one or both of the American ships of the line, and they now have 4 or 5 ships of the line against none for the Americans, that is a gulf that the Americans cannot make up, because anything they try to build to replace them, obviously all the British would have to do would be match that construction, which they're more than capable of doing, and the British would still have a 4 or 5 ship advantage. Heck, even if they destroy them, then they've still got a 3 ship advantage. And therefore they remain pretty much unchallenged, because the Great Lakes don't have any third rates, the backbone of most ship of the line fleets. So it's purely about these big ships. Of course, and the flip side is, if the Americans manage to destroy, cripple, capture the British ships of the line, then of course they have an advantage which is pretty much insurmountable. Even if even though the British have slightly greater shipbuilding capability at that stage, and theoretically if they lost all of their ships, or maybe lost 2 and 1 was left badly damaged, in theory they could potentially make up that loss over time. The fact is, if the Americans then have the dominance of the lakes with at least 2 of their own ships of the line, then they don't have to wait for the British to complete those ships. They can sail in and burn those ships on the stocks, as they historically did with one of the frigates the British were building earlier on in the war. So that's why I say, essentially, if one side or the other manages to eliminate the other side's ships of the line at that point, they've won. That's it. The Great Lakes campaign, at least in this area, is pretty much over. Lamprolingen asks, is demolishing fire synonymous with withering fire as far as the terminology of the era is concerned? This is to do with the Age of Sail. Not quite. You can find the two terms used synonymously occasionally in period sources and perhaps a bit more in modern sources, but very technically speaking, withering fire is usually used in the context of a fire that is, or broadside, that is wiping out large numbers of the ship's crew. So, for example, the Royal Marine that stuffed that keg of musket balls down Victory's carronade before it blasted into Bucentaur, that would be withering fire. And if you look at accounts at the time, they'll say things like a withering fire was opened on the enemy's deck, and large numbers of men were killed and wounded. Whereas demolishing fire is related to demolishing shot, and demolishing shot is usually, at least in an Age of Sail context, specifically concerned with things like star shot, bar shot, and chain shot, which are intended to take out the enemy's sails, masts, and rigging. Now, of course, theoretically, if you double or treble loaded it with solid cannonballs and fired it into the hull, you would technically also be demolishing the enemy hull. But as a general rule of thumb, in the Age of Sail, a demolishing fire is looking to actually remove chunks of the enemy ship, usually concerned with masts and sails, although not necessarily all the time, whereas withering fire is more usually directed at the enemy crew, so leaving the ship more or less intact. Matt Kidd asks, in Master and Commander, Midshipman Calamy was promoted to acting third lieutenant. Calamy would still have to pass his lieutenant's exams, right? Were such promotions common, and what significance did they have? So an acting promotion, as you mentioned, was, I mean, it's not common as in you're not going to have one every single voyage, but it's certainly not uncommon. An acting promotion essentially comes about when a position that needs to be permanently filled on the ship for whatever reason, usually because the position has associated administrative tasks and also potentially is also in the chain of command for the ship, and therefore it must always be filled. If the position holder is no longer there for whatever reason, perhaps they have been promoted higher up or they've been killed, then someone needs to be placed in that position for the running of the ship. So with the third lieutenant, he's directly in the chain of command if something happens to the captain and the other lieutenants above them. And lieutenants would typically also be in charge of certain areas of the ship. So, you know, it's not just a rank, it's this whole command and control element which needs to be taken up. So you would select, in this case, the best of the midshipmen and say, congratulations, you are now third lieutenant. Now, Calamy would still have to take his lieutenant's exams at some point, but for the purposes of an acting promotion, whether that be midshipman to lieutenant, lieutenant to captain, or whatever, because it's an emergency field promotion, you don't have to take any of the admin side of things, but the promotion only lasts until that position can be filled by someone who's actually of the appropriate rank, which would usually be at the end of the ship's voyage, or potentially on a very long mission if you meet up with a fleet or a squadron and they're able to second one of their own over. And then you'd return to your previous rank. In most cases, there are rare cases where you may have an acting promotion, but then upon return to the UK, in this particular case it's the Royal Navy, you may then have that promotion confirmed because of your conduct, basically, if you've done a good job in the role. Now, in terms of what significance they have, well, obviously there is a potential of you just being put straight into that actual rank well before your seniority would necessarily mandate that you should be. And even if you are returned back to your original rank at the end of that mission or that voyage or whatever, that's still going to reflect very well on your record, because if you have demonstrated that you can handle the capabilities of someone a grade above you very well, then you may receive the promotion permanently to that rank much, much quicker further down the line. Or you may be invited, if in the case of a midshipman, to almost immediately take a lieutenant's exam, and then obviously you might then end up permanently properly as a lieutenant. So if you do your job well, it can be a path to quick and easy promotion and future favour. Of course, if you make a complete pig's ear of the job, then that may have a negative effect. You may not be ever promoted to that rank, or certainly for a very long time. Clayton Bradish asks, so there's a lot of information about the German plans to invade Britain, Operation Sea Lion, but what was the Royal Navy's plan if the invasion did occur? In typical British style for the period, there was no one single counter-invasion plan that assumed that, okay, the Germans are coming, we will do this. There were instead a whole variety of scenarios that were looked at and discussed, and then depending on what the Germans did, one or more of them would have been implemented, but almost certainly would have also had to be highly adapted on the fly, because the specific circumstances would have varied somewhat from anything anyone had pre-prepared. And also, during the period that Operation Sea Lion was theoretically potentially able to be pulled off, or at least attempted, the strength and positioning of Royal Navy forces in the area was somewhat fluctuating, shall we say. So look at some of the things the Royal Navy considered, because various counter-invasion plans are available in the archives. So they've looked at what if the Germans come the shortest route, the Dover to Calais route, versus what if they head for somewhere like Plymouth or Portsmouth. Now, of course, Dover to Calais is the shortest, it's the quickest for the Germans, but it's also the most obvious. It's one of the few places that Britain has relatively modern coastal defences. And so, but to be perfectly honest, unless you somehow managed to take the port of Dover, and there was an extensive demolition plan for that, the Dover area is not somewhere you really want to be trying to land. There's a reason there's the song The White Cliffs of Dover. You could land an entire panzer division at the base of those cliffs. It's not going to do you any good at all, because panzers can't climb. And obviously, the further west you go, the more favourable landing areas you find, and the less defences there are, but the longer it takes you to get there, which means more opportunity for counterattack. But then on the other hand, you have the fact that the Dover-Calais route is perhaps the most open to Royal Navy counterattack from forces based in the North Sea, whereas if you are further west in the English Channel, then you could potentially try and block the Dover Straits with mines and U-boats. I must say, people who you occasionally see going on and on about, oh yes, well the U-boats would escort the invasion convoy. No, they wouldn't. That's just stupid. U-boats on the surface, which is what they would have to be to keep up, are possibly the single worst type of thing to escort an invasion convoy with. They're incredibly vulnerable, and the minute they submerge, the invasion convoy is going to outrun them, which kind of goes completely against the whole purpose of using them as escorts and putting them as a static line ahead. Well, Germany doesn't actually really have enough U-boats to pull that off, and static U-boats sitting right off the British coast is a easy ASW exercise for British ships. Mines would be more of an issue, but there's quite a lot of minesweepers around as well. So, where are the Germans going to land? Location is one thing. Then you've got the case of when are the Germans landing in terms of night or day. How much air superiority do the Germans have? Have they got air superiority because they've knocked back 11 Group, but there's still a substantial number of RAF aircraft in 12 Group and further north? Or have they completely diminished the RAF entirely? Or are they just mounting a massive aerial operation that day and even 11 Group is still active? So, how much air cover can be provided? How contested are the skies going to be? And then, what is the strength of the German escorting force? Are they going to commit just, everything up to destroyer size, or are they going to throw everything at it? The Panzerschiff, the heavy cruisers, potentially Sharnhorst and Gneisenau, if they can make one of them operational and get them to the right area. And then you have the weather. Do the Germans try and go during a clear period, which is easier for navigation and so forth, but more open to attack? Or do they try and go during a period of fog, which makes it less likely that they're initially going to be spotted, but also makes Royal Navy counterattack somewhat safer from Luftwaffe counterattacks? And the list goes on and on and on. So there are, for example, Royal Navy plans that envisage the Germans' invasion convoy leaving in the early hours of darkness, intending to cross the Channel at night and attack at dawn. And some of those counterattack profiles call for destroyers to basically use radar to slip in amongst the German convoys and deal death and destruction on a wide scale, essentially firing in all directions with all weapons, and relying on the fact the Royal Navy has about 6 or 7 times as many destroyers in the area as the Germans do to just wreak havoc. And of course you'd have MTBs and MGBs and other smaller craft supporting the attack, so German Schnellboote and so forth that were supporting the German invasion would be engaged by their own peers. And given that some German barges might be swamped by close pass by a fast destroyer, that's potentially quite damaging, especially if there's also a fog or a mist, because at that point the Germans, yes, they have their own radar on some ships, but they'd essentially be looking at, random dark shapes appearing through the murk in the night, opening fire, destroying a bunch of things, and then slipping away again. And that's the kind of the low end of the scale. And then the upper end of the scale is at one point you have Hood, Nelson, Rodney, a cruiser squadron, and 3 destroyer flotillas, all on anti-invasion duty, coming from the North Sea, and I believe it's one of the R-class stationed in Plymouth to the west. And kind of, if you like, the maximalist plan, which assumes either, again, nighttime and fog, or that the RAF can guarantee at least some fighter cover to break up enemy air attacks. That assumes then a big surge by minesweepers and destroyers to purge the channel of most of the mines and submarines that might be present, and then going hammer and tongs and pincering the Germans, ideally, as the plan says, ideally as they're approaching the beaches, i.e. when they can't really run away and they're pinned against the coast. So, yeah, nightmare scenario for the Germans, and best case scenario for the Royal Navy would be the Germans are dumb enough to try and sail straight for the port of Dover. Through various intel methods, the Royal Navy gets wind of what's going on, and then come 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, some fine summer's day in 1940 or 1941, as the Germans are preparing to try and enter into the harbour itself under fire from the Dover coastal batteries, you have Nelson and Rodney punch through the fog to the east, opening up with every single gun they've got at short range, followed by, more cruisers than the Germans ever had, followed by 8 or 9 times as many destroyers as the Germans ever had. And just as what's left of the German escort thinks about maybe counterattacking at that point, some portly old Revenge class comes tooling up from the other side and just starts ramming things for giggles. Greg M. asks, USS Minneapolis and USS Pittsburgh lost their bows for different reasons during World War II. Is their survival as extraordinary as it seems? How do the crews of those ships get them seaworthy enough to return safely to port? And did other ships lose their bows and survive? Yeah, losing bows seems to be a somewhat preferential sport of US heavy cruisers. Quite a number of US ships had their bows blown off during the Guadalcanal campaign. But it's not exclusive to US ships. I mean, HMS Eskimo managed to lose her bows twice, which seems a little bit careless to me. And she still survived to the end of the war. The thing is, a ship's bows are probably, if you're going to lose any portion of the hull, and obviously ideally you don't want to at all, but if you are, the bows are probably the best place to be lost. Because if you get hit in the stern and the stern falls off, that usually means your rudders and or your propulsion systems are also in a very, very bad state. And also the aft end of ships tends to be somewhat fuller than the forward section, and therefore you lose more buoyancy. And of course, again, with the propellers being there, there's potential for flooding up the propeller shafts. Whereas the bows tend to be relatively fine, relatively lightly built, and don't have a huge amount of volume. So you don't actually lose all that much buoyancy. And indeed, some bows are net negative buoyancy anyway. So the overall ability of the ship to stay afloat, if you lose the bows, is potentially not massively compromised, except for the fact you now have water slamming against internal bulkheads where water was never supposed to be. That is a problem, and that is what needs to be shored up. But if you can get that shored up, and your subcompartmentalization in the ship's design was good enough in the first place, and assuming you were at action stations, getting your bows torn off is probably reasonably survivable, assuming your damage control procedures are up to spec. The most important thing you're going to have to do if you lose your bows is to slow down. Because if you slow down either to a crawl or to a stop, the pressure of the water on your surviving bulkheads is not going to be too huge, which gives your damage control crews a chance to shore them up. Ideally, you want to go into reverse. The first big hurdle that ships could fall at in this kind of circumstance would be if you either don't notice that you've lost your bow, or for whatever other reason you keep going at speed, because then if you're moving at 25, 30 plus knots, that's a huge amount of water pressure smashing into your internal bulkheads. They almost certainly at that point will give way. Flooding will spread into the more full portions of the ship, and then you start to go heavily down by the bows, and then all of a sudden it's so long farewell and good night as you imitate the Titanic with the plunge to the bottom. And indeed, you can see that even with a hole in the side of the ship near the bows, like the hole that Bismarck suffered in her engagement at Denmark Strait with Prince of Wales. Although Bismarck was still afloat, she was limited in speed because even though, the bow hadn't fallen off, the same principle applied of if you went too fast through the water would come streaming in through the hole near the bows, and that would cause bulkheads to collapse under the pressure. So essentially, you have to slow down, hope you don't have any fires or any big ones, and then your damage control crews shore everything up. Then ideally gingerly reverse your way to a position where you can conduct further shoring up works. In the case of US ships at Guadalcanal, it usually involved cutting down a bunch of coconut trees to make a temporary barrier, and then you can sail off to somewhere where you can have a temporary bit of plating plated over, and then you can sail off to a shipyard that will do proper full repairs. And finally for this week, Greb asks, I'm world building a D&D world and was wondering about advice for making a major navy power around the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. What ships and technology should I consider, and which should I avoid for the time periods? No magic, no steam. And possibly what tactics would said navy use? So a full answer for this, you probably want to drop me a message on Discord or something and we can go over it in more detail. But I'll give you a few pointers here to consider. Firstly, if you're looking at the late Middle Ages to early Renaissance, you have to consider, are your ships and is your world using gunpowder or not? Because this is kind of the introduction period for cannon as a relatively major element of the ship's armament. Obviously, if you are going to have cannon, then you're going to have late carracks, early galleons as the primary arm of your navy, assuming a few other things which we'll talk about in a minute, versus if you haven't quite brought cannons in, or maybe they're only just coming in, so maybe ships are carrying 1 or 2 guns, then you're looking at sort of early to middle period carracks and potentially earlier still designs of ships. I mean, cogs and hulks are a little bit past it by the late Middle Ages, but their immediate derivatives might still be around for merchant service as well. And of course, merchant ships might be taken up into naval service. Then you've got to decide, is the nation in question large enough, powerful enough, wealthy enough, and centralized enough to actually have a state navy of significant size? Or are you looking more at a situation like the English in that period, where you have the Navy Royal, which contains maybe a few dozen ships of varying sizes, but the bulk of the fleet for national defence and potentially national offence is actually made up of privately owned vessels who are just serving under the command of appointed men with a corps of royal vessels in their midst. And then you have to look at ship type. So it's not just about, are these ships going to be armed with guns or not? It's also about what kind of operating environment are they in. Are you looking at a major naval power that's operating primarily on the high seas, in which case high-sided, big forecastles and stern castles, regardless of gun armament, are probably going to be the order of the day, with maybe fast pinnaces and things like that as scouting vessels? Or are you operating in a more enclosed environment like the Mediterranean, perhaps with less tidal range, lots of coastal waters to operate in which case things like masted galleys and potentially galleasses, especially if you are bringing in gunpowder, are going to be more common. Now, of course, there are also structural differences in capability. Galleys are very, very capable if there is low, no wind or shallow water, as was said, but once the wind picks up, much bigger vessels, like big carracks, kind of tend to roll over galleys quite easily, even if both sides are armed with guns. So you might have a mix of ships Again, a lot of it depends on the geography, not just of the home nation that is the major naval power, but what is the overall environment that they're operating in. Are they fighting a nearby enemy in relatively confined waters, like somewhere like Sweden versus Russia in the Baltic? Is it a bit bigger, like the Ottomans versus the Spanish and the Papal States, etc., in the Mediterranean? Or are we talking about an Atlantic-style scenario? So, drop me a message, refine down based on this, and we can go from there. And that's it for this week's Drydock questions. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you're all feeling well. In Britain, we notionally have summer, which mostly means a lot of rain that we should have had in spring. Hopefully some of you have got wherever our sunshine has gotten, has wound up with you guys. And, see you again in another video.